Hey everybody, welcome to the Script and Style Show. This is the show where we talk about web development and the personalities behind it. I am Todd Gardner from Track.js JavaScript Error Monitoring, and with me my co-host David Walsh, creator of the popular blog davidwalsh.name. How you doing, David?
All right, how are you?
I'm well. You were on vacation. How'd that go? Kind of.
It's kind of a staycation, kind of not. So we went to a place in Wisconsin called Door County.
Oh, I've been to Door County. They make wine.
The Hamptons of Wisconsin, if you will.
The Hamptons of Wisconsin. If Door County's the Hamptons of Wisconsin, what are the Dells?
The armpit. So my wife grew up going to this timeshare, right? And it means a lot to her. She loves going there. It's not my favorite place to go, but I tried to be good guy Dave and take the wife and kids up there, so they got to splash around in the pool and have fun while I basically worked the entire time.
That was not much of a vacation.
It is for me.
Different walls to look at.
Right, different walls to look at. Although I did get some weird looks because they have a central rec center, but this is like a timeshare in Wisconsin, right? So there's a bunch of older people there go chill out during the winter. And they have a seniors swim class, and I was getting weird looks from the older ladies in their swim class, like I was peeping in or something. It was really weird, but the family had a good time, and I got some work done, so that was a good deal for me.
Well, that sounds great. So our topic today is around open source, inspired by a conversation that David and I had at the end of last week's show and a couple of Twitter threads since then. And I wanted to welcome on our guest today, Mr. Ashley Grant, who has a lot of experience with open source, being one of the community leads or the community lead for Aurelia.js and a Microsoft MVP. Thanks for coming on the show with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So kind of one of our traditions on having guests is to ask for your origin story. So you are a pillar of the web development community and participation in open source. So how did you get started in this industry? What brought you to software development?
So going way back to college, I was not one of those people that did a lot of software development in high school, but I liked playing around with computers and everything. But I wanted to be an engineer when I got to college. And at Florida State University, when you take an engineering major, the first class you take is Intro to Engineering. And they tell you this is the most fun class you will take your entire college career in engineering. And I was bored out of my skull the entire class. And I thought, man, if this is if this is the fun course, it's all downhill from here. So knowing that I liked computers, I did something that so many people I think have done. And I said, I like computers. I want to program. I'll be a computer science major. I went into it, and 4 years later, graduated with a computer science degree and struck out as a contractor here in Tallahassee doing state government contracting work. It wasn't very fun. Typical enterprise style software on the .NET stack. I did that for about 10 years. And then I was starting to get, I was getting bored with that. And I decided I wanted to find something new to do. And I attended a conference in Las Vegas back in 2014. And while I was there, I did a ton of work learning Angular. And I was really excited about Angular because this guy, Rob Eisenberg, was on the Angular team at that time. And
Rob Eisenberg, the Aurelia Rob.
The Aurelia, yes. And so I was thinking, man, I'm going to learn Aurelia. I'm going to learn Angular, and everything's going to be great. I flew home from that conference on Saturday night, and on Tuesday morning, Rob announced he was leaving the Angular team. And I said, oh, crap. Maybe this Angular thing isn't for me. And I reached out to him. I'm a .NET developer, no real JavaScript experience. And he said, well, I'm starting this new framework. Would you be interested in joining the team? And I said, yes, I would. I have no there's no reason I should be on this team. But yeah, heck yeah, I'll do that. It sounded fun. I'd always wanted to be in open source development. I had worked with open source stuff as many web developers. I had looked at things like jQuery and Backbone, and so I joined the Aurelia team and found that I'm way better at using frameworks than I am at building frameworks. So I decided that my niche on the team would be teaching people how to use the framework, going to conferences, working on Stack Overflow and things like that to help the community. And it's been a crazy ride, almost or over 3 years now that we've been working on Aurelia, and it has definitely changed my career for the positive.
Well, that's awesome. Go ahead.
I had like basically the same experience with MooTools, right? Like there were other developers on the team who were like super brilliant and didn't want to do a lot of community stuff. Instead, they just wanted to like focus on the core code.
Yeah.
But having the role as, I don't want to say evangelist because you're still doing coding, but being in a position where you can teach people how to use it is just as valuable as the people, writing the code in the background.
I have to agree, since that's my my role on the team.
We've got to stick together on this.
Yeah, but I will definitely say I think it's way more fun, schmoozing at conferences than, for me at least, than sitting in this office working on templating algorithms. So.
Amen.
But that being said, like you said, it's really important. And Jeremy Daniel from the Aurelia team, I remember going to see him give a talk at the Vermont Code Camp, and there was 15 people in the room, and he was incredibly nervous on stage. So that's one of the great things about open source teams, is that you find your niche and you succeed because of what you are good at.
Right.
So for those who might not be familiar, can you maybe describe what Aurelia is and how it's different than some of the other things on the market today?
Sure. The Aurelia framework, we are yet another JavaScript framework of the hundreds of thousands that are out there nowadays. We focus on the MVVM pattern, model view model. The MVVM pattern utilizes strong data binding, which data binding has sort of fallen out of favor in the JavaScript world over the past couple of years, as people have looked at virtual DOM and decided that virtual DOM was the way forward and the way to have the best possible performance. We disagree with that, and we find that we can provide incredible performance for your UI in the same way that more virtual DOM based frameworks and libraries can, while at the same time providing what we feel is a much more developer friendly, if you will, user experience, developer UX. The developer teams that I work with who are using Aurelia, they're always amazed at how quickly they can get up and running with the framework, just because we make it easy for them. So, and at the end of the day, I feel like as a developer, just not having to fight your tooling is really important. And so your framework is part of your tooling if you're building web apps nowadays. And so we try to make your life easier.
Awesome. That's great. So our topic today is open source. And by open source, I don't mean that we're going to talk about particular open source packages or particular open source communities. We're going to talk more generally about open source as a distribution mechanism or work mechanism of modern software development. Before we dig in too deep in that, I want to just define what do we mean when we say open source? I know we have all kinds of different people who watch this show, and so I want to make sure that we define that. And so when you say open source, to me, all that means is that the source code of a piece of software is available for me to look at. Anything beyond that could be open source, but like it's a subdivision of that. Like just I might not be able to sell it. I might not be able to use it. All that open source really means to me is that I can see what the source code is. Does that match what you guys see, or do you have like a more specific definition there?
I think a lot of people, see open source as the way that they want to use something, and not specifically the way that you laid it out. And we'll get to talking about, sort of attitudes in open source. But for me and everyone that I've sort of spoken to over the years, open source means that, the source is there for you to see, but also there for you to use. And whether that's right or wrong, we can argue that. But for me, that's sort of the attitude that I've seen on the web over the past decade.
Yeah, I would have to agree, especially coming from a Microsoft background where for a long time, the source code was available for the .NET framework. You could debug into it, but you were not allowed to modify that code or fork the code at all. And so just having access to the code, I personally don't feel is enough to make something an open source project.
Okay. So not only do you have to have access to the source, but you need to be able to potentially modify it in the common definition, you'd say.
For me, yes.
Okay. So there's lots of different license models attached to different open source projects. Probably the most common one used today, popularized by GitHub and most of the community on that, is the MIT license, which is incredibly open in terms of what you can do. You can take the code, you can modify the code, you can repackage the code, you can do all kinds of anything you want to it, basically. There's some more restrictive licenses under the GPL and a few other ones that I'm not familiar enough with to name, but I know that there are others that are more restrictive that might have like, restrictions on like, well, you can see it, but you can't sell it, or, well, you could use it, but then you can't sell the product that you use it in, or something like that in order to guarantee open source. But one of the things that's happened more common recently is that an open source project doesn't necessarily mean nonprofit. This was originally pioneered by Red Hat, releasing their version of Linux, and more recently Microsoft, having taken a tremendous amount of their core development tools and making them available, right?
Yeah, even with the Aurelia project, originally our plan was to create a for-profit company wrapped around the framework. The framework was and always would be free, but we were going to develop tooling and maybe a widget library around the framework to help us pay for the full-time development of the framework itself.
Cool. So you're going to be like, what's that company that always does it in the .NET space? Dev Nexus or something like that. No.
Telerik.
Telerik. Yeah, you're going to be like a Dev Express inside of your own framework. That's cool.
That was the dream. Didn't work out that way, but I do think that the fact that open source, the code being freely available, but not necessarily being nonprofit is an important distinction for us to make, because we got to put food on the table. We're developers, and if we're giving away all of our work, we're not putting food on the table.
Yeah, absolutely. So where do you draw that line? So you said that was the plan then. Can you speak to anything about, like, well, what happened? Why didn't that work? Or where are you going towards now?
Well, in the specific case of Aurelia, it turns out that building or selling widget libraries and the stuff that we were looking at wasn't quite as lucrative of a market as you might expect, especially in the JavaScript space, because so much of the competition was open source, and developers more and more expect to get their widgets and widget libraries for free. And so it turned out not to be reasonable in our specific space. If we were in a different space, for example, the .NET space, where developers are more used to having to pay for high quality widget libraries and tooling like ReSharper, maybe it would have worked better for us. Now, regarding just open source in general, I think for a lot of people nowadays, there's two paths you can go. Your employer is paying you, and you happen to be able to spend some time developing an open source library, or typically in that case, it's something like Facebook, where the open source work you are doing is integral to their business. In the case of something like React, same with ASP.NET, .NET in general over at Microsoft. But the other side would be someone like me who makes their money through consulting on either just as a developer in general, or the open source library that they work on in particular.
Traditionally, that's the way that I've seen it, right? It sort of surprised me when you said that the idea was to create a business around it in the beginning.
Yeah.
A lot of the experience that I've had in the open source community has been people creating some sort of framework, like the Dojo Toolkit would be a perfect example, where the framework got so powerful and popular that the creators were like, oh wow, we should do something with this, right? And they sort of built the consulting on top of the success of the framework that was there. In this case with Dojo, it being SitePen.
Yeah.
And I believe that there have been a few businesses that at least started out around with jQuery developers, core developers, creating a business out of that as well. That's sort of always been my experience. So it was really interesting to hear that model.
Yeah, the key to understanding why it seems like we were, that with the framework, from the beginning, the idea was to create a business around it, was that Rob Eisenberg, who had created it, this wasn't his first rodeo in open source frameworks. On the Silverlight and WPF platform, he had built a library called Caliburn, did a rewrite of that called Caliburn Micro, which is actually used to this day. I downloaded Handbrake recently to transcode a DVD, and noticed that Caliburn is on Windows, at least, is the UI framework for that. After Microsoft deprecated Silverlight, he moved over to the web and took jQuery, Knockout.js, and Require.js, brought them together into a framework called Durandal. And he had always, all along, been building or doing consulting and using his libraries for his consulting. Typically, the frameworks came out of the consulting and not the other way.
Awesome.
So,
cool.
Yeah.
So the common kind of developer idea, the zeitgeist, if you will, around open source is overwhelmingly positive today. Like, people who talk about open source talk about all the advantages that we've had from doing it. You guys have spoken about projects coming out of work and enabled hundreds, if not thousands, of developers and projects to go faster and build stuff on. Open source has enabled us to do all kinds of things around normalizing our industry around common patterns, because we can all share the code. GitHub's kind of at the core of this, and a big part of their success has been advancing this idea around open source and making it super easy to do. And ultimately, we can all build things faster, right? Because we can just take these building blocks from all kinds of different people and put them together. And the amount of code that we have to write ourselves in order to accomplish something is generally smaller, right? Would you say that?
Yes.
Yeah, I think so too. And not only that, but as sort of a positive side effect of that, we get to delegate, some of these tasks or some of these open source projects we use to people who are experts at them, right? So when you look at React, it's being created by amazing JavaScript developers at Facebook. Really the same. CSS library is the same, right? So you have the people who are really good at the minutia of a given language or technique, creating things for you.
Yeah.
And that is a bonus to both the developer, because in a roundabout way, of course, they save time. But even better for our users are getting the product of, in a lot of cases, the best available minds, so to speak.
Exactly. And you go back 10 to 15 years when there was much less, especially in the enterprise, much less open source. You had a single source for the framework you built your code upon, and you had to hope that there weren't bugs in there. And if you found a bug, you had to submit a ticket and just hope that code or that bug would get fixed. Nowadays, we have the best and the brightest at, for example, Silicon Valley types, the Google and Facebook, where they're open sourcing code that they're using in anger on a daily basis. And so
they're using in anger.
Yeah, they're in production, they are fighting battles with the code, and in a way that for example, a Java or the .NET stack of 15 years ago really wasn't, where that was just developed in a almost in a black box and then thrown over the fence. But nowadays we're able to benefit from the battles that Facebook has fought with, for example, JavaScript runtime performance, and we get that for free. So
there's a risk that comes along with this, though, right? Because we're trusting other people to run major parts of our application, and that's entirely appropriate. Like, kind of in my head, there's like this tree of trust with like open source, right? And at the very top are like the open source projects that are just so core that they like define the standard. So like OpenSSL, right? Like the things that like, this is just how you do it. This is the only way you do it. Everybody just, it's the commonly accepted way to do it. Yeah. And then below that are like the core manufacturers. So like Google, Facebook, those sort of libraries out there where they've made things generally available, and there's a big-ish team of people whose job it is to support it, and it's actively used in that sort of things. And you can trust those people to make rational, generally good decisions. But then once you've like gone down that path and you're just like, well, I'm just going to assemble my application from these, then you start getting into the lower levels of this pyramid, where maybe the decisions and the quality of the code that you're assembling isn't quite what you thought it was. Like you have this assumption that just because you pull it off of NPM or you pull it from GitHub that, oh, it's clearly going to be good, right? It's got like 10,000 stars. But there's been projects that have had a lot of stars that have been like malicious or wrong.
And it doesn't even have to be the small projects that you just assume are good because they're on NPM. Even as a counter argument to what I just said, at Facebook, they are, at the end of the day, they are developing React to solve Facebook problems, and you may not have a need to solve those same problems, or the way that they are solving problems might not be the best way to solve those problems for your business. And that's something you have to think about, because at the end of the day, Facebook is not a software company in terms of, they're not selling, because they're not selling React or GraphQL. You can't, the whole idea of a throat to choke, there isn't a throat to choke at Facebook in the way that there might be going back to, non-open source or even open source plus support models.
Yeah, understanding like the profit mechanism, I think, is important for anytime we're pulling together software, right? Like if you are choosing to use React, you have to understand just what you said, that Facebook is incentivized to build a better Facebook. They're not incentivized really to help you. That's a byproduct. Yeah. Apple is trying to sell you more iTunes subscriptions and more iPhones and more MacBooks. And so anything they build is going to be towards that goal. Microsoft used to be trying to sell you Windows. Now they're more about trying to sell you Azure, right?
Yeah.
And Google is basically trying to deliver you a better ad. So you have to look at like that is their core motivation behind everything they do. And it may not always align to what you're trying to do.
Yeah, and as you said though, it goes from the big companies that are doing open source work all the way down to, just you or me in our office working on something that we're passionate about, but that we might become less passionate about at some point. And because we are I might be the sole developer of noun.js, and it's the most amazing way to do the thing it does. But, I get hit by a bus, or I just decide that I don't want to work on noun.js anymore, and nobody else wants to pick up that torch. This software can go by the wayside, and you have built your software upon those Lego blocks, and they might start to crumble.
Yeah, and to something that you said, Todd, you mentioned OpenSSL. OpenSSL got hit by the Heartbleed bug, right? That caused a whole bunch of problems across the internet, right? So we also need to realize that we need to do our own quality checks and review of sensitive pieces of open source software that we use. For example, I know that most developers who use NPM, they say, oh, hey, there's a package to help me with login, and they use it. You don't know that your credentials of your users are being like siphoned off to some hacker when using that. So we've also sort of come to the point with open source where we're taking advantage of the fact that there might be bad people out there, and the software that you're using, you probably shouldn't be using. Like, do you guys feel like we've also gotten to that comfort level where it's like, okay, I need something to help with this. You Google it. Oh, hey, there's something on NPM. Let me try it out. And like, that's as far as you get with it, just looking at the API.
Yeah, like I think a lot of developers have this assumption that if it's a popular project on GitHub and if it's, out on NPM and it, is the first search for your response, that somehow it's good. And neither Google or neither GitHub nor NPM do quality or safety checks on anything that they put out there. Yeah, just because it's out there doesn't mean it's good, and it doesn't mean that it's not going to steal data from you.
Yeah, I just opened up one of my projects and did the properties on the node modules folder. It's 25,594 files. We say we have to do these audits on it, but at the end of the day, how can you? I mean, it says 5,300 folders. I mean, who has the time? You have to expect that the wisdom of the crowd is going to do you good at some point, but you have to pay attention to find out when the wisdom of the crowd turns out they were wrong, and now everybody's saying don't use left pad or whatever.
That's a really good point. I mean, like, you're not even, it's not just that you need to review the code of the package you're using. I mean, the spider web of dependencies in these apps have gotten crazy. And like you said, it's almost impossible to review every single piece of software that gets pulled into these projects.
Yeah.
So I pulled Webpack into a project I was working on late last week, and the act of just saying npm install Webpack pulled in like maybe 300 downstream dependencies of Webpack. That was just so many files that like there was no way I could possibly audit them and understand what's going on. But not only that, I kind of question whether the people behind Webpack could audit them all and understand what's in them.
That's actually something that we on the Aurelia team looked at. And for the core of the framework, we have no outside dependencies. So that when you pull down Aurelia itself, it's just our code. That being said, our CLI and everything, we cannot build all of that stuff ourselves, and it's the same way. Do we on the Aurelia team understand what we have with our CLI in the same way that the Webpack team? What do they have, or what are they building upon? And is there a Bitcoin miner or something deep down in there?
Potential business idea for anybody out there: build a system that will certify safety and maliciousness of NPM libraries and put like little badges on it. Earlier, you mentioned you're kind of talking a little bit about developer burnout of like if you depend on a lot on some function out there that's or some package, open source package, and it's not being maintained by like Google or Facebook or Microsoft or whatever. It's being maintained by Jane from Ohio. She works on this particular package. She had this great idea once and she put it out there and it got popular. And then all of a sudden a bunch of people started depending on Jane's package and she started getting tons of support requests. But she had a job. She didn't have time to fulfill everything and she just kind of burns out. She like you can only go for so long having a job and then having a whole nother job of like people complaining to you on GitHub about why your software doesn't do the thing you thought it would.
Yeah. And
so I start to think about sustainability when we talk about that. Like if you don't make some money, like if I'm writing a piece of software and I don't make some money off of this thing I do, I'm not really getting a reward for the time and effort that I'm spending beyond like community standing and ego, which is definitely important. But
ego being the most important, of course.
Absolutely. But like ego is a short-term motivator, right? It's not a long-term motivator. It's like if you're getting paid, if I can actually like help pay my mortgage or buy beer or go on vacation or whatever because I work on this thing, I have this long tail of incentive to keep doing it, which makes it more sustainable. Whereas if I'm just doing this because my name is Jane and I want to be really important and I have this package that everybody depends on, but that's my only incentive, eventually you're going to burn out, right? Like you're just going to say, I'm done. I'm going to go work on something else. I'm tired of this thing.
And that happens with both individuals and teams, for example. You know, as part of the greater MooTools team, we were getting feature requests every day. And like you can't say yes to everything. And even down to my individual MooTools plugins, which were pretty popular, you would get feature requests and you would get people not just requesting things, but I think that like the right word is entitlement. I think at a certain point, entitlement comes into it from the user perspective. And I've caught myself feeling that way as well, where, you know, there's an issue or a feature request and it has 1 billion thumbs up, but the developer doesn't want to do it. And you sort of sit there and go, why aren't you doing this? Everybody wants it. But like you said, we as users of open source software, as developers, we need to sort of check our attitude as far as what we expect. Because in the end, we aren't owed anything, and we should generally always be appreciative of the fact that we get to use this project, package, product, whatever.
And I think that something both of you are getting at is one of the I feel the major failings of the current state of open source, and that's that people still look at open source libraries as products that they submit support requests to, and they don't look at the whole ethos of this is open source. You can help out. You can come in. Yes, you may not think or actually be as good of a developer on this platform of whatever you're using, but you can help out. You can do some work with your issue request. I recently we had an issue come in on, I believe it was the Aurelia CLI, and the guy he wanted something, and it was very, very easy. The thing he wanted, it was a small little enhancement. And so I just typed out everything he would need to do and said, would you mind doing this? Would you mind submitting the pull request? Then you're an Aurelia contributor. And he had never thought, or she had never thought of that. And I think that's a real problem is encouraging people to pitch in and realize that, community is not just about GitHub stars and Twitter followers. We're all in this together. We're building these bits of software together.
I have a lot of sympathy for people who want things but don't have the time to do them. For example, yes. When I was at my first job in a little web shop, we used open source because there was a whole bunch of stuff built for us already that didn't cost us anything, right? And when you work for a small business, money's really important.
Yeah.
And so there were times where I wanted to submit something to the framework or share it with the general community, and my boss was like, "No, this is our competitive advantage to get us clients," right? And where do you as a developer, can't do anything there, right? Like you really have little power unless you go against your boss's wishes. But
well,
I
would say
don't want to donate that time either.
And that's something where we as developers have to get the snowball rolling down. You got to flake by flake build up that snowball and change the opinions of management and companies. There's so much, and I think this was one of the initial things that got me into this conversation with Todd is large companies that, even the ones that are building it, like a Microsoft or something, they're asking for help from outside, but it's the other side where, a huge company, a large consulting firm or something is using all of this open source software, and they think that they have some competitive advantage. And so they're making money, but they never give back to the community. And so all of a sudden some communities go away, and they're like, well, what could we have done? There just was nothing we could do. It just went away. We have to move on.
So the first part of that argument, I was like, I don't see why. Like if a private company can take something from the open source community and then like package it, I like, there doesn't seem to be anything wrong with that. It's that second part that's like, all right, I totally agree with you. They can't then go back and say, well, why did the community die, right? Like there was a thread which was started your and our initial conversation from a guy named Zed Shaw, where he had been asked to contribute some documentation back to Microsoft. And he wasn't a Microsoft employee, but he was being requested by a Microsoft employee to contribute something back. And his basic take on it was, if I can build something and it's inherently valuable, then I'm going to package it and sell it myself. I'm not going to give it back to you who has paid people to do this.
And when I initially read the Twitter thread he created, I was taken aback. But I have to say that as I've thought about it more and more, I've moderated towards his opinion on certain things. I do feel like documentation, though, is something where, at the end of the day, that is, nowadays, at least with the way that Microsoft in particular is doing documentation, where it's on GitHub, that is a public good. And if you have found something that isn't documented well enough and you figure out how to document it better, you should help the community out so that those who come after you, trailblaze.
Yeah. I think there's a line in there somewhere, right? Is that if you're documenting of like, this API just isn't explained well enough, and like, here's a subtlety in the behavior, I should just clarify it. I totally agree. Contribute that back so everybody knows. But if you've thought of a new way to teach like a concept that's kind of unique to you, the market out there for software training has been blowing up for the last few years. Like Pluralsight's about to go public for like $1 billion. Having solid developer training is valuable. Like the market is kind of saying that this is valuable. So if Microsoft wants you to go back and contribute, like, oh yeah, here's just a clarification to this thing, cool, I get that. If they want you to contribute like a training session, that's like, no, like you should put that, you should sell that.
On the software side of things, if you find a tiny little bug fix, a couple lines of code, that's one thing. But yeah, if you happen to you're working and you somehow invent a better fetch client, and that is your competitive advantage, even though it's built on the foundation of open source work, maybe that's okay. Maybe, okay, listen, part of what we bring to you as a client is a better foo than what is out there in the open source world. And that is one of the things that the MIT license allows, is you can take our stuff and you don't have to contribute back. and that I do feel like that compared to the GPL, where that's parasitic and says if you use this code, you have to give or publish publicly any derivative code that you write. That kept companies by and large out of the open source space. But with the advent of the MIT license becoming popular, that has allowed corporate America to become more amenable to this. But it does give us that problem where, we got to find that line of competitive advantage versus giving back to the community so that this remains a viable thing.
Yeah. Going back to David's point on entitlement. So once these corporations start using the open source tools, and it's like MIT license, so they don't have to contribute back, they use it. They'll like grab open source packages, and then they start treating it just as though it was their commercial package that they were used to interacting with. And they'll file a support request and have like high levels of expectations around like when this thing needs to be fixed. It needs to be fixed in these sort of many days. And I've seen lots of examples of that. I believe Rob Connery had published something on Massive, which was a package that he had helped create or was a creator of, which was like an ORM a while ago. A bunch of people like posting, insistent change requests on his thing. And he was just saying, no, this does what it does. And they were being quite rude about the whole thing. And I think that echoes some experience that I've had. When we first launched Track.js, we're not an open source tool, but we did have a free plan that people could come in and just use the software for free. And what we noticed is that the free users were the most abusive of the system, most demanding of our time and our energy to support them, and got the most upset when we didn't give them an answer that they liked. And we since found like tons of actual like business documentation, like studies that have been done about this, of that if you tell somebody that something is, or tell a person that this thing is free, they subconsciously value it less.
Yeah.
And so when we decided to get rid of the free plan, because we don't have it anymore, like our support costs all went down, and like the cost of people, the general happiness of our customers went way up. Because the people who stuck around, like they understood the trade-off. You can't say yes to everything.
That's like a broader business issue too, though. Like that's not just like software. For example, my wife's employer did a Groupon, and the people that used the Groupon reported exactly what you reported, in that they were much more picky. They were much more just in general troublesome, right? So I think it's really interesting that sort of followed into the open source software industry as well.
On the Aurelia project, we have a GitHub issue template that says if you need support, go to Stack Overflow or pay us. This is not a support forum. This is for issues with this is for bugs in the framework, and we still have people who completely delete. Even though it says, if you don't follow this template, we will summarily close your issue, they still they just delete it and write out, this thing isn't working how I expected it. Can you make it do this? And then they get really mad when we close the issue.
Reading is overrated. I get contact form emails from people who think that I'm the David Walsh that outed Lance Armstrong as a cheater, like the British journalist. Like no one's gonna read, right? That's a whole different episode of the show. But I've been through exactly the same thing in open source as you, with regard to trying to steer people in the right direction.
So one of the other things I think about with open source is that when you're asked to start an open source project, or when you let me start over. When you think you have something valuable and you're like, hey, I'm gonna open source. I'm gonna share this thing I figured out back. In a way, I compare it to what a lot of designers talk about, is to work for exposure. There's a lot of designers when they're first getting started, like they can't get a paid job. And so like they'll work for exposure or be offered work for exposure. We're like, yeah, you'll just design me this website or design me this ad campaign and you'll get to put it in your portfolio. And there's a lot of hate around that idea, but there's definitely some parallels to that, to, you know, taking something that you've created that's valuable and then open sourcing it to build your reputation. What do you guys think about that? Am I way off? Is that like totally wrong in my head?
I am of so many different minds on that, because I do think that, you know, do it for exposure really is BS, and it's how people just try to get free labor out of folks. But one of the problems I've seen in the software developer community is, oh, well, you don't do any open source work, you must lack passion. You must not be a passionate developer. I can't hire you because you don't have passion. And it might not be that you're not a passionate developer. It might be that, like, I have car stuff behind me. Maybe that's your passion when you're not at work, and you do software development to put food on the table and to help with your other hobbies. And you're a damn good developer, but you just don't want to do it in your free time.
I generally find that the kind of companies that look for passion are also the ones that are most likely to exploit the goodwill of their employees and create cultures around like working too hard or working too many hours or spending too much of their own personal time. There's like, I don't know. I don't like that word. I think when you start putting that word passion, that you're passionate about this thing, that it can create all kinds of incentives to take advantage of people.
Yeah, my experience has not been that. Passion. I'm not the most talented developer in the world. I'm very much not. But I do think that my enthusiasm has gotten me to where I am. And going back to exposure, I mean, I didn't create my blog for exposure, right? It was sort of therapeutic for me at first, but I certainly recognized pretty early on that the exposure was very good. And I can like credit passion and exposure to being where I am right now. But I've not fallen into the trap of working for someone that wanted to take advantage of me.
Well, but what I'm getting at is that just doing, having a blog or doing open source work, the lack of doing that doesn't necessarily mean you lack passion as a software developer. It just means that that's not what you want to do in your free time.
Yeah, I agree. That makes sense. I mean, I wouldn't do car stuff in my free time, but I understand what you're saying.
Well, and actually, though, that brings, for me personally, that brings up a good point, and I can talk about this because nobody on the car community side of things will be listening to this podcast, at least the people who would care. I was kind of passionate about cars and the community around cars. Here in Tallahassee, I created the local Cars and Coffee meetup. And I grew it to a certain point, and then I was like, this is no longer fun for me. I handed it off to another person, and they built it, and now it's huge. And I kind of call myself the organizer emeritus of that. But through that, I was a member of the BMW Car Club, and someone asked me if I would be the vice president of the local chapter. And I said, sure. I mean, it doesn't seem like the leadership does anything. So yeah, I can do that. And 6 months later, the president resigned, and now I'm the president of the chapter. And it has sapped a lot of the passion that I've had out of me, because now I have a bunch of people yelling at me for not doing enough, or for doing too much, or for doing it in the wrong city. And it's no longer fun. And that's what happens sometimes, I think, with open source developers, specifically the ones who their product does become popular. It stops being fun and becomes a job that many times is an unpaid job.
I've seen a lot of founders of JavaScript projects leave because of exactly that point. It started out as a passion project, and the entitlement and the demand of their time turns into a sort of a negative, turns into a nightmare.
Yeah, so when you're looking at depending on some open source package for your project and you bring it in, I think it's important to look at who's maintaining it. And if it's, just some person out there, I think you need to be prepared to be like, well, this code might never change ever. And if I need it to change, I need to be the one to do it.
Yep.
I may or may not be able to actually issue, changes to it. Maybe the right way to interact with this is actually just to look inside of how it does things and copy and paste it out, which I'd argue that's what we should have all done with LeftPad. We should have just copy and pasted the code out.
We just added it to the language. Part of ECMAScript now.
Well, good.
Yeah, we fixed that problem, nipped it in the bud. But no, seriously, that is specifically, I think, in the JavaScript space with node modules and the whole idea of micro modules or micro packages. You do have developers blindly using stuff, and they don't have that thought process that you have, or someone 3 levels down from them in the NPM tree had never had that thought. And then suddenly LeftPad comes and someone gets mad because people are important. Notice that throughout this entire conversation, we haven't necessarily been talking about code. We've been talking about the people. That the people are important, and with that, we need to maybe think about hitting the fork button on GitHub instead of the npm install command for some of these smaller projects.
I like that. I think that's probably a good place to end this. Why don't we go around and kind of pull away our core thoughts? David, what did you think? Let's have you go first.
I think that I've been incredibly lucky to work as mainly an open source developer for the past decade. It started with Dojo at SitePen. Most of the stuff that we created for client work, if it could be helpful to the framework itself, we were able to, in many cases, merge with the framework. And then obviously at Mozilla, I get to spend almost all my time working on open source work. I think that obviously the people are most important, and I've been really lucky to work in projects where the people in open source and the community around them were very good. And I think that if you're a developer who's looking to work more in open source, the attitude of the community and the developers itself should determine if it's worth your time to try and pitch in. How about you?
After you, Ashley.
I was going to say, you took the words out of my mouth. At the end of the day, most open source work is done for free, or possibly even done just on, it's extra work at your job. And so if you're not having fun, what's the point? And so I think that the community, the developer community, needs to spend more time thinking about having fun and enjoying what we're doing, and not just yelling at each other, whether it's in GitHub issues or saying that the thing you've chosen is the wrong thing, and so you're dumb for using it. Just like, let's all have fun.
That's awesome. We should have fun. We should have more fun. I like that. I really like how you summed it up before we started this, that it's about people. That when we're looking at open source software, we have to think about the people behind it, who they are, what are they doing, what's the organization, what are their incentives, all of those sort of things. I think that's a really good message. So that was it for our show today. Thanks so much for everybody watching us both live, all 7 of you, which was awesome, and the couple hundred that'll watch us on YouTube after the fact. If you have ideas for topics we should discuss in the future or guests we should have on the show, please let us know. I am on Twitter at Todd H. Gardner, and my co-host
David Walsh at David Walsh Blog.
Thanks so much for joining us. See you next time.